Good morning, everybody. Welcome to session 3 for Intergenerate Australia Online Conference Day 2. Great to have you here in this session. This session is one of those practical, even, shall I say, experiential sessions, which is a great opportunity to be a part of. Stacey and Beck are going to give us some ideas and also sort of let us in to their thinking, let us into knowing how they plan and dream about how they can help people of all ages engage with the Bible. Stacey and Beck are part of Intergen, and they're going to fill you in a moment about what Intergen is and how that all works. Intergenerate Australia website, intergenerate.com.au, and if you go to resources, to the useful links, you'll find the resource there that Stacey and Beck have prepared for us. Stacey, can I hand to you, and can you tell us a bit about yourselves and what is going to happen this morning? Thanks, Stacey.
Thanks, Louise. Just before we get started, I'd just like to take a moment to say that Beck and I come to you today on land that was created by God and entrusted to the care of the Wurundjeri people. And we just want to take this time to honour the resilience, wisdom and leadership of their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm Stacey. I'm part of the Intergen team. And Intergen is a Melbourne-based organisation that does training, resources and mentoring for people doing intergenerational ministry. And one thing Intergen is really passionate about is the Bible and opening it up together intergenerationally and how we can do that in a meaningful way. This has been a bit of a journey for us. How do we open the Bible is probably one of the most common questions we get asked. And in response to that, we spent a lot of years creating some really fabulous and creative resources that were usually met with big smiles of encouragement and confused looks. And so we thought to ourselves, well, that's okay. Some things you just can't learn out of a book or by reading it off a screen. So we started running workshops where we would actually go through these resources and how to use them. But then the encouraging smiles started to fade. And the comment we heard most frequently was, that's amazing, but I could never do that. Or I can't imagine how we would use that in our context. And this workshop is a response to that learning. So I'd like to introduce Beck, who's going to give us a rundown about what this session will include and what you can expect. Thanks, Beck.
Hi. Part of my favourite thing about doing intergenerational work is that it requires us to be flexible. It requires us to think on our feet and to kind of adapt to fit our congregation, our gathering, our meeting, our group of people. When we initially agreed to do this workshop, it was supposed to be face-to-face. We were going to be in a room with you, 130 odd wonderful people, actually having this conversation face-to-face. And so when I wrote this workshop, I wrote it around that framework, that we were going to be in the same place at the same time and that we were going to be able to riff off each other, that we were going to be able to collaboratively come up with a way to engage with this resource. But thanks to the apocalypse, we are doing FaceTime workshops. And so I had to adapt the way that we engage with this content so that it works in a Zoom. And then I handed that material to Stacey, and Stacey went, well, that's great. I can see how that would work in Zoom, but I can't imagine how that would work in my community context. And so what we actually decided to do was use a resource that was originally written for one context, adapted for a Zoom context, adapted from a Zoom context for a community context, and use this as a great big workshop, a case study for how you do this stuff responsively, dealing with things like a pandemic, which changes our context of our communities, and which takes a resource that is designed one way, that you might Google and find a thing that you like the look of, but you can't quite work out how to apply it, and to give us a framework for how we pull it apart, how we ask the questions that we need to ask to help apply it to our context. So that's what we're going to do today. Stacey has prepared a video of how she would use this resource in her community context. Then I am going to take us through a little bit of a collaborative exercise all together, and hopefully we will all be kind of gathered into an opportunity for us to pray and lament together. And then we're going to do a little bit of pulling it apart and working out how that works, why that works, and looking at these questions that we ask. And then we're going to break out into some breakout rooms, into some small groups, to actually sit with a group of people and work out how would I take this resource and use it in my context, using these questions to interrogate the way and the framework around it. How would we apply this in our spaces? And then we're going to come back together again. And so if you've got any questions or bits that you've just gone, I can't work out how on earth I would possibly use that, or I can't get over this one little bit, there's a hurdle there and I can't work out how to do it. So then hopefully we'll have a little bit of a chat together as a great big group and work out some ways that we can overcome some of the challenges that we might all be facing using these resources in our context. So that's the plan. We'll see how it goes. Thanks, Zoom. This is very exciting. I am going to throw it back to Emma now, who's going to play Stacey's video.
It's on screen.
God of the angel armies speaks. Exactly as I planned, it will happen. Following my blueprints, it will take shape. I will shatter the Assyrian who trespasses my land and stomp him into the dirt on my mountains. I will ban his taking and making of slaves and lift the weight of oppression from all shoulders. This is the plan, planned for the whole earth, and this is the hand that will do it, reaching into every nation. God of the angel armies has planned it. Who could ever cancel such plans? His is the hand that reached out. Who could brush it aside?
Isaiah 14, 24-27. The Lord Almighty has sworn, surely as I have planned, so it will be, and as I have purposed, so it will happen. I will crush the Assyrian in my land. On my mountains I will trample him down. His yoke will be taken from my people, and his burden removed from their shoulders. This is the plan determined for the whole world. This is the hand stretched out over all nations. For the Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart him? His hand is stretched out, and who can turn it back?
We usually think about slavery in two ways. Something awful that happened a long time ago, or as a metaphor for things that feel inescapable or unjust. The slavery that Isaiah is talking about here was a weapon of warfare used by the Assyrian army. When they conquered a city, they would take the people away and make them slaves. The Assyrian Empire was one of 4 powerful empires named in the book of Isaiah, alongside the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. Their armies were efficient, trained for warfare and conquering, and they were extremely good at slavery. This passage is filled with images. I wonder which ones you noticed. The image of yokes and burdens are used to represent a type of slavery where people are seen as little more than livestock, like animals used for farming, people who can be bought and sold. Slavery remains an issue today, despite being illegal in most countries. When the passage talks about the Assyrians, they are being used to represent a broader concept, the oppression of people by those with power. Oppression is a type of injustice that happens when one group of people uses the power they have to take away the rights or harm another group of people. This also happens in our world today. We're going to write a prayer together using this passage from Isaiah 14. This is a special kind of prayer called a lament. It's a prayer that talks about things that make us sad or angry. So let's think about the things we see in our world today that cause oppression. You are welcome to come and take some paper and write or draw images to represent the type of oppression you see or have experienced. Isaiah 2 reminds us that God's plan is the radical transformation of the earth. Here we see the image of the mountain of the house of the Lord being used as well. It is used to describe what things are like in the kingdom of God. On God's holy mountain, it says, they will beat their swords into ploughs and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up swords against nations, nor will they train for war anymore. Now I'm going to read out the passage. While I'm reading, I invite you to bring what you have written or drawn and place it on the yoke. The Lord Almighty has sworn, surely as I have planned, so it will be, and as I have purposed, so it will happen. I will crush the Assyrian in my land. On my mountains I will trample him down. His yoke will be taken from my people, and his burdens removed from their shoulders. Let's say together, we see the oppression in the world. Stretch out your hand, God, and make it right. This is God's plan, determined for the whole world. This is the hand stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart him? His hand is stretched out, and who can turn it back?
Where there is violence, let there be peace.
Where there is poverty, let there be generosity.
Where there is discrimination, let there be equality.
When things are unjust, let there be justice.
Thanks, Stacey. So I hope that you can see the way that that activity would work in a community context. So what I'd like to encourage us to do now is to shift our thoughts from observing how it would work to actually participating. So in a context where this is coming out of as an activity added onto a message. So Stacey's incorporated some context and some framework around what was actually going on in that passage and incorporated that as a whole unit. The way that I have adapted the resource is less holistic and more as an activity that you would add into an existing service. So I encourage you to switch your brains now into participation mode and to think about the ways that this passage actually lands for us individually. It seems like we are all actually enslaved to something. When we look around the world, there's lots of oppression. There's the influence of powerful forces that influence and shape the way that we live our lives every day. But when I read through Isaiah, it's really clear to me that God's plan for the whole of creation flourishing involves the freedom of humans from their suffering. The people of Judah, when we read through Isaiah, the people of Judah were facing down imminent suffering. The Assyrians were powerful and they were right there. They were coming for them. They were efficient. They had trained their whole lives for war and for conquering, and they were very good at it. They were very good at slavery, and the people of Judah knew what was about to happen to them. We're going to use this passage from Isaiah as an opportunity for us to speak out and to pray and to declare God's better blueprints for the world. So what we're going to do now is make a little bit of space to brainstorm the things that we can see. We're going to do this as collaboratively as we can in Zoom. So I'm going to encourage you to use the chat. Think about some powerful influences that we can see in the world and pop them into the chat. I'm going to keep an eye on it and put it into my PowerPoint presentation, and we're going to use that to collectively pray together in a moment. So don't be shy, but wow, you guys have just gone crazy already. That's awesome. These are great. Okay. Wow. And now I have the unenviable task of choosing just a couple to put into our prayer. So bear with me while I just... Cool. All right. Okay. All right. Let's stop now. Okay. Bear with me while we do this, because now is the tricky part. What we're going to do is we're going to go through some of these and come up with a specific way that this impacts us and our world. So let's step away from it being an abstracted thought that, okay, so slavery exists and it is a powerful influence in our world, correct. But think about for a moment, let's use slavery as our first one. What is a specific way that slavery impacts us and the way that we live our lives? Cheap clothes, excellent. Thanks, Alison. That's a great one. Okay, so we see slavery as a powerful influence in our world. Sorry, now I'm trying to type and talk, and that's just not going to work. And the impact that it has of producing cheap clothes and child labour. Hang on.
I think cheap everything.
Yeah, cheap everything. You're totally right. Okay, so another one. Let's have a look for another one is... Oh my gosh, there's so many good ones. I want to do them all.
There was slave to social media.
Yeah, okay, let's do social media. Okay, so we see social media as a powerful influence. So I would like everyone to have a think about what is a way that that impacts you specifically. Oh, Alison on fire with all of the answers today. Oh my gosh, okay, that's heaps. All right. Social media and the ways that it fosters, let's go with fosters inauthenticity, bullying, and distraction. You guys have got some great answers. I'm really impressed at how easily you're thinking through this. It's great. All right, so going back to, we'll do one more. Should we do racism just because that's particularly topical at the moment? Let's do racism. Let's take the bull by the horns and deal with racism today, shall we? Let's have a think about the ways that that specifically impacts our life right now. You guys are great. All right. Okay, so we've found racism, and I've kind of looked at all of that and gone, let's go with and the ways that it dehumanizes and divides us. Those are really great responses, and I really appreciate how much you guys are all participating. It's really great. So what I'm going to encourage us to do now is I'm going to share this PowerPoint. I'm going to share my screen, and I want to encourage you to read along. You're all muted because there's 130 of you, and that's a whole other level of chaos if we all start reading out loud together. But it's actually, this isn't a performance. So it doesn't matter if anybody else can actually hear you pray. The point is that we're praying, that we're speaking this stuff out to God, and that we're offering it up to Him as a lament about the way things are in the world. So join with me and be present to what the words are actually saying. Be present to the ways that this is relevant for us in our own little context right now. And I'm going to try and share this without messing it up, so bear with me 1 second. God of the angel armies speaks. Exactly as I had planned, it will happen. Following my blueprints, it will take shape. I will shatter the Assyrian who trespasses my land. I will stomp him into the dirt on my mountains. I will ban his taking and making of slaves. I will lift the weight of oppression from all shoulders. We see the oppressors, O God of angel armies, and their oppression in the world. We see slavery as a powerful influence and the impact that it has on producing cheap clothes using child labour. Stretch out your hand, God, and make it right. We see social media and the ways that it fosters inauthenticity, bullying, and distraction. Stretch out your hand, God, and make it right. We see racism and the ways that it dehumanizes and divides us. Stretch out your hand, God, and make it right. This is the plan, planned for the whole earth, and this is the hand that will do it, reaching into every nation. God of the angel armies has planned it. Who could ever cancel such plans? His is the hand that's reached out. Who could brush it aside? Join with me now, if you haven't been reading along already. Help us to be your hand, God. Help us to make it right. Thank you for joining with me in that prayer. I appreciate how engaged you have all been and how thoughtful those responses are. That's really powerful and really important. That we are able to sit in this space and to think about those things critically. So thank you for participating. I'm going to throw it over to Stacey for a minute, and she's going to have a bit of a chat with you about how she thought through the adapting process to get from this to what she presented.
Thanks, Beck. As Beck said earlier, when I first saw the written instructions that Beck sent to me, I kind of went, okay, because the language wasn't very familiar and it's not language I would use. The format itself wasn't that familiar. And I really couldn't even imagine how I could possibly use it. So, of course, my very first thought is, well, we need to fix this. And that's not true. Beck and I, we're quite different people. Beck is very creative and artistic and amazing. And so My default is always there must be something wrong with how I've read this, because clearly Beck's better at this than everyone else. So, you know, it's obviously me. And I'm also a big fan of avoiding conflict. So while I was kind of going through all these thinking, I hadn't actually let Beck know any of this. So I did sit down in the end and go, okay, have some confidence. What would we do differently? And from there, I began the process of adapting that activity. Well, initially, because I thought I would tell Beck and she would fix it and make it great. And then I thought, well, actually, what's going on here? So the first thing I did was I looked at, you know, well, what's Beck's point here? What's she trying to achieve? And so I looked at it and I thought, well, she's trying to open a discussion about oppression, give people a chance to reflect, process and respond to some of the systemic issues that have been raised by the COVID-19 and the racial justice protests, but also to gain a deeper understanding of God's vision for the world and how we can join that work. That was something I could really get on board with. And so then I started thinking about, well, how would I do that? And at that point, I came to the realisation that the difficulty I was having wasn't with what Beck had written, but it was the fact that our contexts are quite different. The space I inhabit leans heavily towards the evangelical end of the spectrum, and we only ever paddle in the Pentecostal pool. We never use written liturgies, and so we don't do communally read prayers. But what is expected of me is a process of shared exegesis. So in our intergenerational community, we are expected to kind of work collaboratively with a text and exegete what that might mean. And we also use a process that we've called, and you know, if you ever want to quote me on this, that's fine, called embodied word. So where we take the word of God and we pick out ways that we can embody what that word is saying, and that's why I selected the yoke. Now, this would also come on the back of a series that we've been going through as a community on Isaiah. And so what I would do would not actually look like the video, because one thing our community really doesn't appreciate is monologues from people like me. And that's great, because it's awkward as anything watching yourself do that. And then I got really excited. So there was no conflict necessary with Beck's awesome resource. It's okay that I wouldn't do it like that. So as I looked at this, the main image that jumped out at me was the yoke. Now, coincidentally, my mum has one, which you saw in the video. It actually used to be used by my grandfather on our farm. So I went and I picked it up and then I put it down, because that thing is really, really heavy. So as I was thinking, I thought to myself, well, that's something I need to think about when I bring that yoke into our community. It's heavy. It's kind of dangerous if kids try and pick it up. So after forcing my, strapping young son, who read the text out for me, to carry it out to the car, and we took it back into the church to film, I actually had a really interesting conversation with my kids about how it worked. And the kids noticed how heavy it was too. And then I imagined how the rest of our community would interact with it as we read about the yoke of slavery and the burden of oppression. This is pretty confronting idea and passage. Isaiah is quite a smitey book, and it gives you a very particular view of God. And I wondered how someone from Syria might hear this passage. I also thought about the images and metaphors that were used. I was going to add some old photos of African slaves alongside an image of an iPhone wrapped in chains to show how we use slavery as a metaphor, but the contrast was horrific. And I wondered how we would wrestle with that as a community. As the kids and I thought about the words we could use on the pieces of paper, I was reminded that this activity could trigger memories of trauma for people. I thought about my own experiences of oppression and trauma, and while I was okay with this, I wondered how others would feel as they looked and touched the yoke. I thought about how I might support them through this process. I recently took part in an event run by a collective of Indigenous theologians who shared their stories and a radically different perspective on Christianity and God. It's a fairly familiar space to me, but I remember how destabilising it was the first time I encountered it. I felt simultaneously defensive, sad, angry, and guilty. And I wondered if this activity might bring up some of those feelings. Our community doesn't really see itself as a safe place. We believe that it's hard to engage meaningfully with the Bible if you want to be safe. And so we hope to create a brave space that doesn't cause harm. So after I'd thought about all of this and looked back at the purpose of the activity, I added the image of God's mountain and the Isaiah 2 reference. I believed it would give people a chance to think about and focus on the new things that God wants for this world. I would also have referenced the consistency throughout the Old Testament prophets and Psalms like Hosea, Joel, Micah, and Zechariah, because this message is carried throughout the Old Testament of hope and transformation of our world. I cut that out of the video because it was going a bit long. I also decided to name the imagery and the reality. This isn't a historical issue that's already been fixed. It's part of our world today. And I used two versions of the text to help deal with the complexity of language like thwart and God of angel armies, which, you know, this is a process we usually do. That's the first thing we do. We write out the passage we're studying by hand. Usually a number of people will read out different sections. And then the first question I always ask is, are there any words you don't understand in this passage? And finally, I stop talking and listen. And that is probably the key to the success of this kind of Bible engagement, is that it can't be delivered as a monologue. So now I'm going to hand over to Beck, who's going to unpack a bit more the process that we use when engaging with activities like this. Thanks, Beck.
Sorry, I got a weird message up on my screen just as I did that. So when I sit in the middle of this process too, and I'm enjoying the fact that you guys are getting a bit of a insight into the way that Stacey and I play off each other to develop this stuff. I really enjoy this kind of collaboration and the ways that it bears fruit for us. My process originally, so I wrote this activity to be used in a face-to-face context. And it was really important for me that when I read this passage, I really wanted us to be able to confront not an abstracted thought about, you know, the world is unjust and, you know, God make it right as an abstracted thing, but I really felt the importance of it being something that lands for us, that it becomes actually us engaging with the content, engaging with the ways that it impacts us specifically. And it's also important for me for us to be able to centre our gathering, our group, and to hear each other's voices. And so in a room full of people, rather than it being somebody delivering content, delivering a prayer, delivering a monologue, then it becomes a collaborative process. It's very hard to do that in a Zoom where it's as collaborative and there are as many voices actually being heard in the presentation as what I would ideally like. But we've done the best that we can to adapt, to make space for everyone to have at least some kind of a contribution. In the handout, I'm hoping that you all have access to the handout at this point. The handout has the passages that we've read out, and then it has a 4-point, some questions to ask as you're adapting this resource. The first one is, what is the point? And so when I adapted the resource from the original one to the Zoom one, I returned back to that point every time. The things that are important are for us to make sure that we are engaging personally in this and that we are making enough space so that people can contribute. The second point is to assess the space. Zoom presents challenges, that's pretty obvious, but in a context where this is face-to-face, people can make small groups, can collaboratively chat so that not everyone has to have their voice heard. If they don't want to contribute, they can sit in a small group and allow other people to talk. In a small group where you know each other really well, everyone can shout at each other and you can collaborate your hearts out, and it works really well too. Obviously, all of that is a bit chaotic for Zoom, and so the way that we have dealt with this space issue is to open the chat and to have people contribute in the chat, which worked really well. I was really pleased with how much you guys engaged with that. That was great. The third point is safety. I don't know about you, but when I'm in a room with people that I know, or even people that I don't know, it's easier to read the temperature of the room, to go, I just said a thing and the entire room went, and I have had to clarify or navigate that collective gasp of horror at something that I've just said. It's very hard to get a gauge on a collective gasp of horror when everybody is muted. So it's very hard to gauge the temperature of the room. It's also very hard for me to know the collective experience of you. As 130 of you, people that most of whom I have never met before, I have no idea things that I'm going to trip over, that are going to trigger you, that are going to upset you, that might actually bring up some trauma. In our gathering where we are in a small group of people, or even in a larger congregation, we know generally the collective story of our gathering, and so we know where we can lean into and things that we should lean away from in order to make sure that that space is safe. Not just physically safe. I mean, we're talking about things like if you've got candles and small children, you don't want to burn the building down, but we're also talking about things like emotional safety and making sure that we're not opening the doors for people to feel really, really unsafe without putting anything in place to make sure that we are actually meeting people's needs. The fourth point is the tricky one, and that's the theological implications of the activity. I'm always very careful when I develop resources to make sure that I am walking a fairly fine line between presenting the text, but also not landing on a specific theological position that might not be held by all of the different types of people who will be using the resource. It's important that it's important for me as I'm developing these things to actually not land on a particularly unique position that actually excludes people from participating because they don't hold that same theological position. It's really important, I think, that we make space for our communities to arrive to the text in the place that they're at, and to be able to journey from that place into a new place where God is taking them, the new place of challenge, a new place of learning, without making the assumptions that, well, of course people are going to come at it with the assumption that X, Y, or Z is theologically true. Specifically with this passage, I was very careful to stay away from pushing this idea that God has a specific plan for us. Obviously, it's been used to justify oppression, and I don't know where you guys are at with this, but I'm going to say it anyway, and because you're all muted, you can't shout at me for it. There has been specific cases in the media this week of prominent people using God has a plan that justifies slavery in the face of the Black Lives Matter civil rights protests. This stuff has been used as justification for why that is okay, that kind of oppression was okay. So being aware of the implicit and explicit theological implications of the way that you are presenting material and the framework around the way that you're presenting it, even the visuals. I have many stories of stupid implications that have happened because of a malfunction of a creative activity that I've done, that I've had to on the fly go, didn't anticipate that thing malfunctioning, but the malfunctioning of the activity actually raises some really problematic theological implications. So let's just stop everything for a minute and talk about what I'm not saying in this activity, and having to deal with those things on the fly. So being able to actually anticipate some of those implications that can happen from the way that you use your space, the way you use your props, the way you use your yoke or your pieces of paper is important. And those two things, the theological implications and the point, tie in together and they bounce backwards and forwards. So as you modify the two things in the middle, the space and the safety and the ways that you're adapting it to fit your group, being aware of returning constantly to what's the point of this, and does changing this thing so that it fits the space actually change the point of the activity, or does it change the theological implications? And are either of those things being changed by me changing the framework of the space? Are those things worth the change? Because actually we're using this resource for a point, and if we change it to make the space more accessible, but we actually lose the point of the activity, then we're actually just taking up airtime in our congregation's life that's not actually making a point, and that's not giving them space to move into what God is actually inviting them to connect with. So I hope those 4 points make sense. Excuse me. What we are going to do now is to go into some breakout rooms. What I would encourage you to do in your breakout room is to use those 4-point questions. We're going to go into our breakout rooms. Please take that handout with those 4 questions and the passage and the transcripts of the way that both Stacey and I effectively presented our content, and take it into your breakout rooms and workshop how you would take this resource and adapt it into your space. There's space on the handouts that if you actually do have it in print copy, you can scribble all over it, or if you just want to use a piece of paper, to have a think about ways that you can adapt it. What are the safety points? What are the space considerations? What are the considerations that you need to make for the gathering of people that you have, that you are going to be presenting hypothetically this with? And then we will come back together in a little while, and Stacey's going to lead us through answering some questions around things that you might have encountered, some problems. So if you do have questions, make sure you write them down, and then we will put them all into the chat and have a bit of a conversation about that at the end.
So questions, comments, have we had any? Do we have any? Possibly pop them in the comment chat section. if you do. I guess one thing I'd like to probably add myself is this kind of stuff takes prep, and it's not just the creative thing that takes prep. It's the work you would do. So I always think about it. I put as much effort into preparing for these kind of things as I would if I was preaching at church. I think it can be tempting to think this stuff is just an easy option. Okay, there has been, how do we ask children what are the powerful influences in the world? What language could we use? That one kind of depends a little bit on your community. In our community, we talk about issues of justice a lot. So that language would be quite familiar to our kids. I guess there are other ways we could talk about it. We could talk about what power is and what influence means, that unpack that with people. That would be one way of kind of getting that conversation started. Thanks everyone for coming. Intergen does have a website. It's called intergen.org.au. If you want to come and check us out, sign up for our mailing list and you will get a copy of any new resources we prepare for you to wrestle with and play with in your contexts. We have an amazing resource on the book of Isaiah coming out very soon called Seeking Shalom. That's full of, this is where that activity has come from. So it's, yeah, full of heaps of different resources to go through the book of Isaiah in an intergenerational context. Okay. If you have any other questions, bump them through to Louise or the Intergenerate team and they will pass them on to us, and we are happy to kind of continue this conversation outside of this space. Otherwise, thanks for having us. We are Intergen. It's been a blast.